Sylvester Stallone watched the first rough cut of his new movie and immediately tried to buy the film so he could destroy it. The year was 1982. The movie was First Blood. The 3-hour cut was so unwatchable that Stallone and his agent walked into an alley behind the screening room and got physically sick. He told Howard Stern years later that he was convinced the film would end his career. But buried somewhere in that bloated disaster was a 93-minute masterpiece waiting to get out. At the center of its most iconic scene was a weapon that would change how America thought about its veterans, its police departments, and the distance between war abroad and violence at home. This is the story of John Rambo's M60 machine gun, but the gun was never the point. It never is. To understand what the M60 meant in Rambo's hands, you have to understand what it meant in the hands of the men who actually carried it, and that means going back further than Vietnam, to the weapon that terrified the men who would eventually build the M60. During World War II, Allied soldiers in Europe encountered a German machine gun that fired so fast the human ear could not distinguish individual rounds. The MG-42 fired roughly 1,200 rounds per minute, twice as fast as anything the Americans had. The sound was not a series of bangs. It was a continuous ripping noise, like someone tearing a massive sheet of canvas. American GIs called it Hitler's buzzsaw. The psychological impact was so severe that the United States War Department produced a propaganda film just to calm down their own soldiers. The narrator actually told troops that the German gun's bark was worse than its bite. Anyone who had been on the receiving end knew that was a lie. When the war ended, American weapons engineers studied what had beaten them. They pulled apart the MG-42's belt feed mechanism and examined the FG-42, a paratrooper rifle designed for Germany's elite Fallschirmjäger units. Then they stitched the two together into something new. The result was adopted by the United States military in 1957 as the M60 General Purpose Machine Gun. It fired 7.62mm NATO rounds at 600 rounds per minute, weighed 23 pounds, and on paper it was everything America wanted: light enough for one soldier to carry, versatile enough to mount on helicopters and patrol boats, and lethal enough to suppress an enemy position from 800 meters away. But the M60 had problems, and they all showed up in the worst possible place. The jungles of Vietnam were humid, filthy, and merciless on mechanical equipment. The M60 jammed when it got dirty. Spent casings got stuck in the chamber, forcing the gunner to swap the entire barrel mid-firefight. And nobody who designed the M60 remembered to put a carrying handle on that barrel. The assistant gunner had to put on asbestos gloves that looked like oven mitts just to grab the red-hot steel and change it out. The gas system worked itself loose, creating what soldiers called a runaway gun, meaning the M60 kept firing after the trigger was released. Soldiers called it the pig. Heavy, loud, hungry for ammunition, and grunting like a barnyard hog when it fired. They jury-rigged fixes with whatever they had. Somebody lashed an empty C ration can to the receiver so the ammunition belt would feed more smoothly. Coat hangers held together parts that should have been engineered properly in the factory. But for all its problems, the pig was indispensable. When a firefight erupted, the M60 was the squad's lifeline. It dangled from Huey helicopter doors, stood guard on firebase bunkers, and accompanied patrol boats up rivers that could erupt with AK-47 fire at any second. In 1966, a Marine named Richard Pittman grabbed an M60, charged into an ambush by a North Vietnamese battalion, destroyed 2 enemy machine gun positions at close range, and held the line until reinforcements arrived. He received the Medal of Honor. The gun that drove soldiers crazy in maintenance was the same gun that saved their lives in combat. That contradiction is the whole story of the M60, and it turns out it's the whole story of John Rambo too. If you're into this kind of deep dive, the stuff behind the story, hit subscribe, because this is where it starts to get interesting. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. In 1972, a college professor named David Morrell published a novel called First Blood. He had been listening to his students who came back from Vietnam carrying invisible wounds nobody wanted to acknowledge. In the novel, Rambo wages a brutal one-man war against police in a small Kentucky town. He kills many of his pursuers, and at the end, Colonel Troutman puts a shotgun to the back of Rambo's head and kills him. The novel spent 10 years in development hell, 18 screenplays. Steve McQueen, Dustin Hoffman, and Robert De Niro were all considered. Then Stallone got involved and changed everything. Stallone made Rambo sympathetic. In the finished film, Rambo does not directly kill a single person. He also refused to let Rambo die. A suicide scene was filmed, but Stallone rejected it on principle. He told The Hollywood Reporter he could not send veterans the message that suicide was their only option. But the original cut was a catastrophe. 3 hours of Rambo wandering through the woods, delivering monologues to owls. Stallone's fix was radical. He cut every single line of Rambo's dialogue. He let other characters talk about Rambo. He let silence build the mystery. The result was a tight 93 minutes, and its climax hinges entirely on the M60. After surviving a manhunt through the Cascade Mountains, after being shot at from a helicopter, after being trapped in an abandoned mine and nearly killed by a rocket, Rambo hijacks a National Guard truck. He asks the driver what's in the back. The driver tells him there is an M60. Rambo throws the driver out. He drives through a police roadblock and rams the truck into the gas station, pumps on the edge of the fictional town of Hope, Washington. He ignites the spilled gasoline, blocking the highway. Then he takes the M60, wraps belts of ammunition across his chest the way soldiers did in Vietnam, and begins dismantling the town. Windows shatter on Main Street. Power transformers are destroyed, plunging everything into darkness. Gunpowder canisters ignite inside a sporting goods store. Then he fires through the roof of the police station, severely wounding Sheriff Teasel. But watch what Rambo is actually aiming at. Not people, infrastructure. He is methodically taking apart the systems a town depends on. The power grid, the communications, the supply lines. He is doing to Hope, Washington, exactly what he was trained to do to enemy positions in Vietnam. The M60 is not a weapon of revenge. It is a tool of demolition, wielded by a man executing the only skill set his country ever gave him. And this is where the mirror between the gun and the man becomes impossible to ignore. The M60 was built from borrowed parts, German engineering copied by American manufacturers who did not fully understand what they were copying. Engineers left in design features from the FG-42 that served no purpose in the new weapon. The people who built the M60 copied the homework without understanding the answers. John Rambo was built the same way. He was assembled from the raw material of a young American man trained in guerrilla warfare and destruction, then sent to a war that broke him in ways nobody planned for. The M60 worked beautifully when conditions were perfect, but expose it to stress and sustained pressure, and it fell apart. The sear eroded, creating a runaway gun that kept firing after the operator stopped pulling the trigger. Rambo is the runaway gun. Sheriff Teasel sees a vagrant, someone to drive out of town and forget. His deputies abuse Rambo in custody, triggering flashbacks to torture he endured as a prisoner of war. They use a fire hose on him. They try to shave him by force, and the sear inside John Rambo finally gives way. This is why the M60 scene terrified police departments. In the early 1980s, the average small-town department carried revolvers and shotguns. The officers in First Blood have Smith & Wesson Model 66 revolvers and civilian AR-15 rifles. They are fundamentally unprepared for one individual with military training and a belt-fed machine gun. The anxiety was real. Vietnam had produced hundreds of thousands of combat veterans carrying untreated post-traumatic stress and training that civilian society never prepared for. The term PTSD did not exist until 1980, 2 years before this film. The prevalence of SWAT teams among police departments doubled between the mid-1980s and the late 1990s. First Blood did not cause the militarization of American policing, but it articulated a fear already simmering that the line between soldier and civilian, between foreign battlefield and domestic street, was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The M60 was eventually replaced by the Belgian-designed M240 in the 1990s, after competitive testing proved the pig was too unreliable. It was quietly put out to pasture, but like Rambo, the The M60 refuses to stay dead. In 2024, the Army signed a $15 million contract for new M60 variants. On the battlefields of Ukraine, photographs have surfaced showing battered old M60s back in combat. A gun born in the 1950s, declared obsolete decades ago, is still finding its way into the hands of soldiers who need something. In the final scene, Troutman talks Rambo down, and Rambo breaks, not in an action hero way, in a human way. He collapses and begins screaming about friends who died in Vietnam, about a boy blown apart by a booby-trapped shoeshine box, about being spit on at the airport. Stallone based that monologue on real conversations with veterans, and the moment he throws the M60 across the room, shattering a window, the metaphor becomes complete. America took its enemy's engineering, copied it imperfectly, called it the M60, and sent it to war. America took its young men, trained them imperfectly, called them soldiers, and sent them to the same war. When both the weapon and the men came back damaged, America did the same thing to both, pretended they were fine, ignored the maintenance, and acted surprised when they broke down. The M60 was never a perfect weapon. John Rambo was never a hero. He was a warning about what happens when a country builds something it does not understand, sends it somewhere it is not prepared for, and refuses to take responsibility for what comes home. If this story stayed with you, the video on screen right now goes deeper into the weapons that shaped how America fights its wars. I'll see you there.